Hello everyone, this is Yours Trivia, and today we're starting a brand new series covering all the items available in the game Total War 3 Kingdoms. Now, in the game, there are 5 main types of items, namely weapons, armors, mounts, followers, and accessories. And today we're going to be kicking things off with weapons. And as you can see here, for some of these item types, such as the weapons and mounts and bows, I will also be including in a tier list of all the unique or gold quality items of that type available in the game, along with these overview guides. So this is why we are staring at an empty tier list at the beginning here. But before we actually start ranking these 28 unique gold weapons, we need to first provide an overview of the weapons in general. So let's first take a look at this set of nice swords to introduce many of the basic concepts in the game. First thing that becomes apparent is that there are 4 levels of rarities for all items in the game, and they are common, refined, exceptional, and unique. Sometimes you'll also hear me refer to them as common, bronze, silver, and gold in reference to the colored circles around each image. And aside from differences in appearance, damage, stats, and bonuses, one key difference among these 4 rarity levels is that common items are provided for free, and you will have infinite copies of these weapons, whereas the opposite end of the spectrum, the unique gold quality weapons, true to their name, are truly unique, as only one copy of such weapon will exist in the game at one time. So once a faction has it, no other faction can acquire it, unless you acquire the character who has that item equipped. But we're not going to be talking about stealing characters here, as that's a topic for another video. And for the 2 rarities in the middle here, you can craft as many copies of those as the game would allow you through chance triggers from each of your level 2 or level 3 forge, or from the 2 weaponsmith counties in the game. And speaking of weaponsmith counties, they are the only organic way for players to craft these gold weapons. And it is entirely through chance, with each level of the weaponsmith upgrade granting you not only increased chance of crafting a unique gold weapon, but also it will shorten the downtime in between each chance trigger for crafting. So try to get to Poyang and Shangyong as fast as you can in your campaigns to increase the chance and frequency of crafting these unique gold weapons, as after all, if the AI faction has them crafted, you're not going to be able to craft them even if you get the weaponsmith afterward. Alright, now that the item qualities have been covered, let's move on to look at how damages are calculated in the game. We can see here that each weapon has a melee base and a melee damage armor piercing, as well as a melee attack rate. So when you do a damage calculation, you simply need to add up the 2 damage types after factoring any armor ratings from your enemy. For example, take this Celestial Sword, which you see has 1.3k base damage and 321 armor piercing damage. And say you're hitting your opponent with this, and your opponent has 50 armor rating. This means his armor will block 50% of your base damage and none of your armor piercing damage. So the 1.3k becomes 650. And if you add on the 321 from armor piercing, you end up with a total of 971 damage per hit. And if you want to calculate down to a DPS figure, all you need to do is multiply your damage per hit by the melee attack rate, which is a reflection of how many times you attack per minute, then divide it by 60 to get a DPS of around 486. So clearly, weapons with more heavily skewed armor piercing damage, it's going to be better and more consistent, because most enemies, assuming you're fighting generals, will have around 35 armor at least, if not upwards of 55 or even 80 if it's a really strong general. And aside from these points about item quality and damage, all weapons will also provide some type of stat boost, like the authority boost that you see here on these swords, and sometimes weapons will even provide additional benefits, like the satisfaction boost that you also see on these swords. And in the rarest of circumstances, some of the weapons will also have a set bonus, as they will be part of an item set, like the Heavenly Sword and Celestial Sword shown here. And if we take a look at the set bonuses, we can see that the Heavenly Sword is part of a set called the Tactician's Design, which will require the character to both equip the Heavenly Sword and Shixie's armor to activate. So Shixie's armor is unique and bounded to Shixie, so only Shixie can activate this bonus. And once he activates this bonus by equipping both his armor and this Heavenly Sword, he will grant 10 points of melee evasion to his own army. And likewise, for the Celestial Sword, the set bonus is called Mandate of War, which will provide own retinues for additional morale when attacking, once you are able to activate it by equipping both the Waking Dragon armor and the Celestial Sword on the same character. So with that, we have an overview of all the basic concept revolving weapons, and we're going to continue this by taking a quick look at all the weapons available in the game, starting with these basic sets, then moving on to the 28 unique weapons before finally wrapping up with the tier list rankings. So let's switch over to Jian from Swords, and we see here that Jian also has a complete set of all rarities, which is definitely not a guaranteed, as we will see very soon. And the first thing we can notice from these Jian is that their damage profile is slightly different from the swords that we just seen, as they will have slightly less overall damage, but slightly more armor piercing damage to make up for it. So in reality, since we talked about how enemy generals typically have around 35 armor rating at least, these will actually do more damage than the swords, even though their overall damage seems lower, just because their damage profile skews more heavily towards armor piercing. And overall, the Jian's always going to outperform because their stat boost is in expertise instead of authority, so that means the user will also get a nice boost to melee evasion, as that's what expertise stat will boost on the character. In terms of set bonuses, we also have two, starting with the Warblade, which can be paired with Master's Leather to trigger a Constellation set bonus that will boost your own army melee damage by 25%. This is rather powerful because anytime you see these own army bonuses, especially on silver item sets, you can get multiple copies of these in the same army for stacking, and that can add some astonishing amount of damage to that army. Then for the Sovereign of Blades, we have a pairing with the Spirit of the First Artist, which will complete the Perfectionist set that will provide your own retinues with additional 10% of range block chance. It seems nice, but if you consider that Sovereign of the Blade and First Artist is a set that's only available for Sentinels if you want to complete the set, given that the armor is only available for Sentinels, then this bonus is only going to go on certain type of shield infantry perhaps in shield wall formation that already have approached 95%. So this 10% isn't going to make a huge difference, but it's always a nice bonus to have. And then continue on with our theme of swords, we have Dual Jian, which is a pair of Jian. And you can see here that once again we have a set of 4, and these are going to have more damage, but slower attack rate. And there's also going to be a penalty to the expertise stat. And we still have bonuses here, with only the Swarm Brothers or the unique weapon having a set bonus, as it can be paired with Noble's Right to trigger the Garb of the First Sage bonus that will give immune to fear and terror just for the user of the items. Next, we have sets of one-handed axe, which only goes to exceptional quality as there are no generic, unique one-handed axe in the game right now. Perhaps this is something developers could add in future patches or DLCs, but in terms of these weapons here, it only goes to exceptional. And this is also the first weapon type that we've seen so far with most of its damage placed on armor piercing damage rather than base damage. And the stat boost here is fairly balanced. You have a bonus to resolve, which increases health on the general, but the penalty to expertise, which reduces your evasion. And in terms of set bonuses, only the War Axe here will have one. It can be paired with the Dignified Raiment, which gives a pretty amazing bonus of 10 points of satisfaction faction-wide if the user happened to be your Prime Minister, heir, or faction leader, and it's an excellent set to give to a commander general in those roles. Then with all these Han one-handed weapons covered, we can move on to two-handed weapons, starting off with the Ji, which is a super balanced weapon, which is not a great thing because you ideally want more armor piercing, but the Ji is still pretty good as it has equal base and armor piercing damage, and both are pretty plentiful. And in terms of stats, it will boost Resolve, and for set bonuses, the Z of the Imperial Guard can be paired with the Hardened Iron Shell for a wall bonus that gives unlocks to a few interesting formations for your own army, while the Z of the Heavenly Mandate will pair with Gilded Turtle for the Fortress bonus, which will grant 3 morale to your own army. Then moving on, we have a set of spears, which is more of an armor-piercing weapon. And for stat boost, it's pretty nice as it gives both expertise and instinct, which are both combat-focused stat, granting additional melee evasion for the expertise and additional base melee damage for the instinct. And in terms of set bonuses, we have Lord of Fire, made up of the Heirloom Spear and the Champion's Leather that will give your own army 20% melee armor piercing damage, which we talked about being very good, and the Fireborn set with Ancestral Pledge and Leather of the Fire Phoenix that will give 20% melee damage for own army. So both of these are strong bonuses, but like I said before, silver sets are great because you can stack them, because you can have unlimited copies of the silver set, assuming you can manage to craft them from your forges or weapon craftsmen. Then for the remaining two-handed weapons, we have a few incomplete sets, starting with these 3 glaives, which is a melee base damage focused weapon with some stat increases to instinct and a small bonus to charge. Alongside the glaives, there's also a battle axe, which is a harder hitting version of the spear weapon with the similar damage profile, just slightly higher melee, pretty much identical armor piercing. But the problem here is you'll lose some of the expertise in favor of boosting resolve on the stat distribution. Lastly, there are 3 weapons here that do not belong in any set, and these are the dual war axes, the martial Ji, and the twin martial Ji. And all 3 of these weapons are silver or the exceptional tier, and they're mainly used as starting weapons for some of the more unique generals in the game. Therefore, they were added in later and not part of any sets with common items at the beginning. And with these, we're done with the Hun weapons and most of the base game weapons. But if you purchase the Yellow Turban DLC, or if you're playing the game with Yellow Turban DLCs in your time period, you're going to find factions that have these weapons, starting with the 2-handed mace shown here. And it's designed to be entirely focused on armor piercing damage. And while there are no generic copies of a unique weapon of this type, there is definitely a bunch of character focused unique maces, as in those weapons are found on certain characters, and they will have the same archetype of 0 base damage and a bunch of armor piercing damage, which make these weapons actually the most powerful in the game, because if you're fighting a 55 armor rating general, these will tear through them as though they're wearing no armor. Then moving on, we have Matched Trait, which is surprisingly missing the common variant, as it will have a refined, exceptional, and unique copy, but it lacks a common version in the game, which is strange. I think what they did was just gave the matched jian to the Yellow Turbans instead of making a common matched tray for them. And that's fine, and these weapons are pretty unique as they are given to He Man in the beginning, and he can upgrade them as he progresses through story missions in-game. And I think that's what these designs are meant for, even with the mace, because eventually you can get a head crusher mace, which I don't consider to be generic. I guess Heavenly Bodies really shouldn't, so maybe that's my mistake. Regardless, moving on, we have a last set of items here for the Yellow Turban, and they're the gun, or staffs. And these have all rarity except for refined. Now, this also might be something that I overlooked, but after checking the game files, I only found a pack image asset for the refined copy, as in an image of just the spear, or just the gun, not the spear, the staff, and there's no stat attached to it. So I thought maybe the developers forgot to implement it into the game. So if anyone have played some of the Yellow Turban Rebellion DLC, maybe seen one before, please let me know and correct me in the comment below. But from what I see, I only found the common, exceptional, and the unique variant. And honestly, these weapons are not much to talk about. They're probably the worst in the game, because if those two-handed mace had all armor piercing damage, these pretty much have all base damage, and they have low base damage. And it makes sense. If you have a staff, you have no pointy end, so where do you get armor piercing? So these are not effective weapons, but it's nice to look at. And with that, we wrapped up all the yellow turban weapons. But before we move on to the 28 unique gold weapons, we also need to take a look at the 3 new common items that were added in the Furious Wild DLC, which features the machete, stone axe, and twin flint weapons, which are all crafted for the Numman subculture, as all Numman generals will start with these as their common infinite copy weapon types. So with that, we can finally move on to the star of this show, which is the 28 unique gold quality items, starting with Ancestral Pledge in alphabetic order. And we'll talk about each of these, and then we'll finally look at the data of these weapons as I have calculated all their damage. I'll rank them by damage, and then we'll finally rank them in a tier list, incorporating not only their damage, how easy to craft or find them, if they're designed to be used by a leader perhaps, maybe the stat boost is really nice, or if they have some really special additional bonuses, or as we've seen already, some of those really unique set bonuses. We'll talk about all of them right now. So, starting with Ancestral Pledge, this is a weapon that you can only acquire in the game through crafting. Nobody starts with this spear. So, it's open game, get the weapon craftsman quickly, level it up, and you have a chance to get this weapon. If an AI faction gets it before you, whether it's a faction that owns the weapon craftsman, or perhaps one of the rebellion factions, Yellow Turban Rebels and Numman Rebels can spawn with gold weapons. If they get it, then you just have to trigger them and try to capture that general and get the weapon from them. But in general, we already looked at this weapon. It's pretty strong. It's focused on armor piercing. The numbers are a little bit low, but the melee attack rate's decent at 24. It's in the middle of the pack. It's not like a sword that's 30, but if you're using a two-hander, usually 24. Sometimes two-handers are slow, like maces, and given 20. And the stat boost is decent, with 12 points of expertise and 12 points of instinct, both combat-focused stat. Fireborn's decent, with 20% boost to melee damage, which is great for the own army, even though it's not going to impact the spear user very much, because you have very low base damage from this weapon. Overall, decent average weapon. Then moving on, we have the Ancient Silver Sword. This is the starter weapon for Sun Jian, and it's an awesome sword for a leader. You have 18 points of authority. The 10 point of satisfaction is wasted on your leader, but if you use it on an heir or one of your prime minister roles, this is an excellent way to keep them happy. The key here is that it gives you unbreakable, which means you can use this general to kite and also sustain yourself in battle. It could become redundant, as if you're going to end up using this sword on a commander class to take advantage of the maximum authority, commanders have a skill in their skill tree that can grant them unbreakable already, so you could get redundancy there. But overall, pretty decent weapon. Damage is high in terms of numbers, but heavily skewed towards base, so it's not as punishing as it can be. But then again, for most swords, you're really going to see a lot of base damage, not a lot of armor-piercing swords. Then continuing with the theme of leader weapons, we have the Blade of Xiangyu, which is the starter weapon for Dong Zhuo. And this weapon you can see here has slightly more melee base damage and slightly less armor-piercing damage, especially compared direct head-to-head with the Ancient Silver Sword that we just looked at. Stat-wise, 18 point authority is the same. Minus 25% enemy armor is the specialty of this weapon. Basically, whatever the enemy armor rating is, if it's 60, if it's 80, 25% of it will be gone when you fight him. So that really helps magnify your high melee base damage, so there's definitely synergy there. In terms of other bonuses, it also grants your character Scare, which is worth about 4 points of morale in battle. That's pretty good, and you get 40 points of extra charge bonus on top of that. So definitely a great weapon, especially considering the fact that Dong Zhuo is a vanguard in the game. So getting that 18 points of authority, some extra charge bonus, some scare, works out very well. And you'd be very happy to get this from Dong Zhuo's faction if you can steal the character, execute him, or if he died through the event and you get this on one of his generals that took it after his death. Very good weapon to have. Then we have the Burning Mace. This is a new weapon added in the Furious Wild DLC. It's given to Dailai Dongzhu, which is the younger brother of Queen Zhurong. So if you play her faction, you can start out with this weapon in the beginning. If you play any other Numman faction, or if you play any other factions in the game, you can try to capture Dailai. It'll be easier with other Numman factions because you can have the guarantee confederate when you beat them. And in that case, you will get Dailai with his Burning Mace, and this is an amazing weapon. It's basically a mace, which has 0 base and a bunch of armor piercing, 2.2k. Now compared to a lot of other maces, this is actually on the low end, even though it looks like a big number. Because if you do the math on the previous 3 weapons, just ignore armor and add up the damage, and you're going to see that none of them can even match 2.2, right? 2.2 is high, even if you just pretend the enemy have no armor, which is never the case. And in this case, whatever you hit with the Burning Mace is going to be no armor anyways, because it's all armor piercing. So it goes clean through. You get 10 points of instinct, which doesn't help because you have no melee base damage. So the instinct will only help you get discount for recruitment. That's the other bonus they grant, but you're not going to get any base damage bonus off of this because you have no base damage. But you also get burning because it's a burning mace. So the enemy that get hit by this will lose 15 points of morale, whether they're a general or a unit. They'll lose half of their melee evasion. This is huge here, because aside from being protected per hit by the armor, your hits can miss due to enemy melee evasion. But if you cut their melee evasion by 50%, now this doesn't mean cut by half. This means if they had 45% melee evasion, they now have 0. If they had 60, they're at 10. It's not divide by half, it's subtract 50. So it's very deadly. You can guarantee you're hard hitting, and each time you hit, you tag on burn on them. That will burn 562 damage over 15 seconds. So over a minute, let's say, that's another, 2,000 damage. It's huge. This is a strong weapon added in the DLC, and definitely the weapon you should aim to get. And then moving on, we have the Celestial Sword, which we talked about. It's pretty generic for a sword one-handed weapon, 30 attack speed, heavy on the base, a little bit of armor piercing. The nice part about this set of weapons, as we've seen, is that they provide satisfaction, which is often a very needed stat on harder difficulties due to the penalty. And Mandate Award's pretty lame. It's 4 points of morale to your own retinue, not very strong, and you have to be on the attacking side. Then we have the Cleaver of Mountains. Oh, before we forget, Celestial Sword, since we did feature it in the set, it's generic. You can produce it in the weaponsmith, and that's the only way to acquire it. And the Cleaver of Mountain here belongs to a starter general, and it belongs to Xu Huang, who will start the game with the Han faction in the 190 campaign and Yang Feng in the 194 campaign. And you can try to get him. He does have a fondness for Cao Cao, so that's probably the easiest faction to acquire him. And this is a strong weapon. Look at the armor piercing, 2k, and then 868 base on top of that, 15 point of resolve, very strong. A lot of these cleaver weapons you're going to see with the big battle axe, they're all going to have very similar stat line, and they're all going to be very strong. Then we have the Dreadbringer, which is the starter weapon for Gongsun Zan. And this is a advanced version of the spear, slightly higher damage. You do pay for it by losing 15 points of expertise, but you get 24 points of instinct, which will magnify your slightly low melee damage. So the thing here is instinct only boosts base damage and not armor piercing damage. So you don't get the maximum value out of that here. You do get scare though, so that's worth 4 points of morale. That's pretty good. The Eater of Courage is a weapon that was added in during the 8 Princes DLC. It's a starter weapon for Sima Yong. And like most cleaver weapons in the game, it has a very high armor piercing damage. You do lose out on some expertise with this weapon, but you gain it back with slightly higher resolve than typical cleaver or battle axe weapons, as you can see from the Cleaver of the Mountains. Then moving on, we have Ganjiang. So this is one of the legendary blades crafted by the namesake of the weapon. There were 2 blacksmith husband and wife combo during the Warring Kingdoms, or rather Spring-Autumn, and they crafted these weapons, and they're named Ganjiang and Mo Ye. And this is one of the pair. Both of these can be crafted from Weapon Craftsman, and this pair here has a decent amount of base damage, not super high, pretty low armor piercing. It gives good stats, 15 points of expertise, 15 points of instinct. It will go perfectly on a Sentinel who wants long drawn out battles where you don't need much damage. You just want to wear down your opponent with your high expertise and kill them slowly. The instinct here will synergize pretty nicely because most damage is on the base damage. Then moving on, we have the Giant Bane, which is the starter weapon for Xu Chu. And this is the typical, mace weapon. 0 base damage, 2.7k armor piercing. And in addition to that, you get 15 points of resolve. So not much to say about it, just a very hard-hitting weapon. Then we have the Green Dragon Crescent Blade, which is Guan Yu's starting weapon. It has very high melee base, and it has decently high armor piercing. And the attack rate is 24, so it's kind of on the spear territory. And you get 18 points of expertise, 18 points of instinct. Most of the three brother weapons, Liu Bei, Guan Yu, Zhang Fei, they don't really stand out very much in terms of raw damage figures, but they all have really good stat boosts. So 36 total stat is one of the highest we've seen so far, and probably the highest of all the weapons in the game. And you get 50 points of charge bonus on top of that. Then we get the Gun of Purity, and this we talked about, very poor weapon because most of the damage is on base. You have 72 armor piercing on top of that. You get a little bit of resolve, but that doesn't really help your combat situation. It's probably one of the worst gold weapons in the game. Then moving on, we have the Head Crusher, which is the yellow turban variety of the two-handed mace. And here we see the same exact stats of Giant Bane, just a different look for a different faction type. Heavenly Bodies, also a yellow turban weapon. This is 1.3 melee, 400-ish armor piercing. You can think of this as one of the sword weapons, except it's two-handed, so you actually lose attack rate. Instead of having 30, you get 24, so that's not good, but the stat boost is decent. 12 point expertise, 12 points of resolve. Pretty good if you have it on sort of a sentinel-like build with Tenacity of Steel, which is available on some of the users for Yellow Turban, especially if you think about this weapon's kind of designed for He Man, who is very strong. And then you have Ji of the Heavenly Mandate, which we looked at earlier. Super balanced weapon, 1.1k base, 1.1k armor piercing, which makes this average. And the set bonus, the Fortress, is not a really good one. It's worth 3 morale, not a big deal. Then we have another one of these cleaver battle axe weapons with the King Wutugu's two-handed axe, obviously designed for the Nanman factions during the Furious Wall DLC. It does give a pretty good stat boost, 10 points expertise, 10 points of instinct, but it's pretty much the same as other battle axe weapons in the game with very high armor piercing and decently high base. Then moving on, we have Mo Ye, which is the other half of the blades that were crafted during Spring Autumn. And this one's very unique in that it's the only weapon that will boost cunning. So here we see 15 points of resolve, 15 points of cunning. So it's perfect on strategists, especially strategists like, say, Zhou Yu, who has the stats and skill tree of a strategist, but has the health of a sentinel. So double strategist health. So you can give him this, which will help expand his cunning and also expand his health some more because resolve gives percentage health boost. So Mo Ye is actually the perfect weapon for strategists and it's very good. And then we have Mountain Thunder, which is another mace weapon with 0 base and 2.7 armor piercing. This is the starter weapon for Shamo Ke from the Furious Wall DLC, and he's a faction leader, and this weapon is very good for it because you do get 10 points of authority for it, as well as 5 morale when commanding, and then the 10 points of expertise will be pretty good for dodging, not bad. It's probably the strongest of the 3 maces just because of the bonus it provides, since the damage profile is exactly the same. And then we have the Serpent Spear, which is Zhang Fei's starting weapon. This, once again, among all the 3 brother weapons, have very high base damage, not so much armor piercing, so the damage total profile is not going to be that good, but stat boost is wonderful. 30 points of stats, 15 expertise, 15 instinct, both good for the damage and for evasion, and then 25 charge speed on top of that. So Zhang Fei is going to be very fast. However, Zhang Fei's problem is lack of health and lack of morale, which this weapon doesn't shore up. So that's a weakness there, but overall, pretty strong weapon. And then we have Shuanggu Jian, which is Liu Bei's starting weapon. Once again, mainly on base damage, not much armor piercing. It's on the low end of things for swords. It's also a dual sword, so you lose a lot of attack rate, which is a little sad. So you end up with a weapon that has the same speed as those polearm weapons like the Serpent Spear and the Green Dragon, but then you end up with much less damage. Stat-wise, like I said, very, very good. 12 points of resolve, 9 points of instinct, 15 points of authority. However, the thing here is Liu Bei is not very strong, so the authority is really all you need, and you only get 15 of it. You're going to see later on a couple other leader swords, especially the ones we've seen already, the Ancient Silver Sword for 18, as well as the Blade of Xiangyu for also 18 point authority. And on your leader, all you really want is more authority, especially Liu Bei, who can get unity points from satisfaction. Then moving on from there, we have the Sky Piercer, which is Lü Bu's weapon. And this is 800 melee base damage, 1.6k armor piercing, which is not high. You might think Lü Bu is very strong, but that's because some of his abilities are very strong. His weapon is not the strongest weapon in the game. The damage profile is actually not that impressive, and you lose 15 points of expertise, which is okay for Lü Bu, because one of his skill have him lose melee evasion anyways, so losing 15 point here is not a bad thing, and you make up for it with 24 instinct, which is okay because you do have 800 base to work with. And the key thing here is this gives him unbreakable, which is what makes Lü Bu stand out because he can fight to the bitter end. Whereas Zhang Fei, we just mentioned, the lack of health on some of the vanguards caused them to lose too much morale when they lose about half of their health and they just rout instead of keep fighting. So by having unbreakable on this weapon, that's what makes this weapon strong. Then Sovereign of the Blades, we showcased before, which means it's a weapon craftsman weapon. It doesn't start out with any characters. It's okay, low damage, low armor piercing, pretty fast attack rate, 18 point of expertise, respectable. Perfection gives that 10% range block chance, which is average, depending on how you utilize your troops. You don't really need it, and it's only own retinue anyways. Then Swarm Brothers, also one of these generic legendary weapons or unique weapons that can be crafted. You have 1.4k melee base, 1k armor piercing. You lose 12 points of expertise for it, but you gain 18 instinct back, so it's more of a attacking weapon. It has pretty good damage profile. If you look at it, it's actually better than Shuanggu Jian or Liu Bei has, but lacks stats. Now, the Garb of the First Sage does give you immune to Fear and Terror, which saves you from some loss of morale. Not a big deal, especially since this user is most likely either Commander or Sentinel. Commanders can get Unbreakable. Sentinel probably benefit the most from this, although this weapon does punish expertise stat, so I kind of question that. Maybe you have someone who has so much expertise that losing 12 doesn't hurt them, and getting them 18 instinct might help them. Or maybe you're using this on like a Nunman general who's classless, and you can build them any way you want. Then lastly, we have the Blue Blade here, which is a weapon that was the starting weapon for Zhao Yun, but then they took it out because it wasn't historical yet. In future DLCs, this weapon will definitely go on Zhao Yun. So right now, because it doesn't start on Zhao Yun, most likely this weapon will go to one of the rebel spawns, so keep your eye out for that. I believe you can't craft this weapon because it's reserved for someone in the future, so look at those rebel spawns. And the reason why this weapon is designed for Zhao Yun is because it has a lot of base, very little armor piercing, so you might think this is a terrible weapon. But stat-wise, it gives you 24 points of expertise, and you do lose 15 points of resolve. But what you want to do here with Zhao Yun or other sentinels with high expertise is that you want to maximize their evasion so high that the enemy barely hits you at all in a duel, and you use Tenacity of Steel or other skills like Elemental Vigor, which is unique to Zhao Yun, to boost your attack at the same time. So you kind of double or even triple your attack, so you don't need much attack on your weapon. You just want to last a really long time. And this weapon also has damage armor, and it's 50%. So it's kind of uniquely designed for some sentinels, and it's very strong, despite the low overall damage setting. Then finally, we have the Red Sister, which is a starting weapon for Zhengjiang. It's probably one of the best weapons in the game, and it gives you a fair amount of damage with 700-ish base, 1.7k armor piercing, 24 attack rate. It's a dual weapon. You get 15 points of resolve, 15 point instinct, but you lose 15 points of expertise, which is okay. It doesn't really matter. The key of this weapon is it enables fatigue immunity. That's huge, because when you're fatigued, your stats will go down. So if you're always fatigue immune, all your charges will stay fresh, all your attack rate will stay fresh, and you'll do a lot more with Zhengjiang because you have the Red Sisters. And that is the only weapon in the game right now that will grant fatigue immunity. So it sets this weapon apart, and by itself, it does decent damage anyways. 1.7k armor piercing, very strong. Even has a little bit of base, 700 to work with, to expand your 15 points of instinct. So overall, very strong weapon. Next up, we have the White Tiger's Claw, which belongs to another bandit, Yan Bai Hu. And this is the only weapon where the orientation of the weapon is to the bottom right. All the other weapon art in the game goes to the bottom left. I have no idea why this weapon is flipped, but it is. And it has a base damage of 1.4k, 1k armor piercing, which makes this weapon pretty respectable. The combined damage is very high here. And it has 24 melee attack rate, 10 points of expertise, 5 points of instinct, so the stat boost is a little low, but you get additional 10% melee damage, which goes for the base, onto this weapon. So technically you have about 1.54k melee damage base, which makes this even a little bit better. And you have this on Yan Bai Hu, who has high expertise, add on the 10 expertise here, he's going to be a pretty good duelist. Then we have Trust of God, which is Cao Cao's weapon. And this is a great leader weapon because you get 24 points of authority, you get immune to fear and terror, which is kind of redundant because you have unbreakable pretty easily from your skill tree. Damage is pretty balanced, 1k 1k for a sword with 30 attack rate, pretty good. Then we have another leader weapon here with Zhang Jiao's staff. This is the Mandate of Heaven weapon added for Zhang Jiao's faction that you can get through a mission. 1.5k base damage, 164 armor piercing, so basically this is the Gun. Right? It's a little bit better than the Gwent because it has some decoration on it. It's a staff. The stat's really good, and the attack rate's really good. So that's where this thing shines, because at least you get 25 instinct, which will help boost your 1.5k melee base damage and make it better. And then you get 10 points of authority to help you as a faction leader, and then 5 points of fervor for character. That part is going to be tricky, because if you're a Han general playing Mandate of Heaven and you get this weapon, with the 5 points of fervor from character, you might not want to use it because fervor for you is a bad thing, unless you're trying to farm rebels. But by the time you kill Zhang Jiao, you're probably not interested in farming rebel anymore. So those are all things you should take into consideration. And if we want to rank these items by their damage output, considering the armor setup, we have this chart here. So here I took each of the weapons and their base damage, armor piercing damage, attack rate, calculate the DPS for if the opponent has 35 points of armor. That's the armor for the common armor for all generic generals. And then 55% armor, that's usually the armor rating for most legendary generals with artwork. And if we look at the damage profile, we see a few weapons with the highest damage, 900. No surprise, those 3 mace with the 2.7k armor piercing are the ones with the highest damage. And the ones with the lowest damage is the Gun of Purity and Shuanggu Jian, Liu Bei's starting weapon, and the Blue Blade. But as we mentioned, some of these have other things going for it. And if you're interested in how these weapons rank overall, here are the rankings for the weapon if you consider 35% armor and if you consider 55% armor. So these are just references if you're interested. All the math are here. And then finally, we're going to hop back to the tier list and finally give these items a ranking. Alrighty, let's rank these weapons. So, starting off with the D tier, we'll start from the worst and go our way to the bottom. The worst weapon in the game is probably Gun of Purity, and the reason is pretty clear. We mentioned it: low damage, right? All base damage, resolve stats kind of pointless, very little armor piercing, hard to get because it's yellow turban only, so you can't really craft this in regular game, and you can't equip it even if you get it because the mace weapon type are only available for yellow turbans to use. Then following that up, we have Shuanggu Jian, which is kind of a surprise because that's Liu Bei's weapon. Kind of want to move it to the front of that. It's better than the Gun. Shuanggu Jian has very low weapon damage, very low. And the other problem with this weapon is that the stats, although really good, are scattered among 3 different stats: resolve, instinct, and authority. And the authority stat's only 15 points, when a lot of the other leadership swords have 18 or even 24 points. So it's really going to miss out on where it needs to be, and that's why I don't think it's that good. Liu Bei is probably optimally used to just get himself killed, so Guan Yu and Zhang Fei can get enraged for loss of Oaththorn and do a lot more damage with their abilities and their weapons. And then before that one, let's see, we can put the Heavenly Bodies. It does slightly more damage than Shuanggu Jian, but once again, the weakness is yellow turban only weapon. The user of the weapon, eventually, He Man, is very strong, so I don't think it's a bad weapon because it's kind of designed for sentinels. But because it's kind of a yellow turban only weapon, I'm going to drop it a bit more. And then we have one more weapon that's also yellow turban. So they're getting punished here. But that kind of makes sense. If it's only good on one person and you can't really use it on anyone else, I can't rank it that high. Zhangjiao staff. So this is pretty much a gun with some decoration on top. And it gives it a little bit extra attack. It does have really good stat to support it because heavy base damage plus 25 point of instinct means even more base damage. So that's good. And overall, you get the fervor bonus and then also 10 points of authority for leadership. So there's a use for this. So I think there's some quality there, but it's really only going to be used by Zhang Jiao himself. If you're playing in the Mandate of Heaven and you get this weapon, I don't think you'll be using it. Because if you are... Well, I guess if you're playing as Yellow Turbans and Zhang Jiao died for some reason, and you picked up this weapon afterward, sure, you'll use it. But if you're a Han faction, you can't use Gun or these staffs, so it's kind of useless for you. So we're going to keep this in the D tier. Then moving on, we have C tier, which I'm going to put G of the Heavenly Mandate right here. The reason why this weapon goes here is not because it's terrible. It has a balanced stat, 1.1k base, 1.1k armor piercing. It has the fortress, which gives you a little bit of morale, gives you 15 points of resolve. Nothing wrong with it. It's just that if you compare this to other two-handed weapon, which is the class that it has to compete with, since generals who can equip this weapon can also equip the other two-handed weapons, this is definitely on the low end. Most of the other weapons have way higher damage, and most of the damage happens to be on the armor piercing side of things. You get other stats. So this is the weaker end of weapons here for the polearm, so it's going to get to the lower tier of the ranking. And then above it, we have a bunch of sword, which I'm not going to say which one's better than which because they're pretty much the same. So we're going to have a bunch of sword that's very similar, starting with, let's say, Moye. Moye is pretty much only good on one character, or it's specially designed for one character, I would say. It's good on Zhou Yu because you get the cunning. That's what makes this sword kind of special, and you get the health boost. So we kind of already talked about that. Damage-wise on the low end, and along with this pair, Ganjiang, is good for most sentinels because you get some instinct, you get some expertise, damage a little bit higher than Moye, so you're going to have more use off of that, and both of these can be crafted, so that's a good thing. And speaking of craftable weapons, I think we might as well put Sovereign of the Blade here as well. Damage is going to be lower than Ganjiang and Moye in most cases, but you get 18 points of expertise, which is a pretty good of concentration stat, and you also get one more set bonus on top of that, which will give you that perfectionist 10 point of range block chance, which is nice to have. And then we're going to put Celestial Sword also here for similar reasons, also something with a set bonus. All these are craftable, so that's nice. And then the last sword we're going to put here is the Blue Blade, which is right now not craftable, which is why it's kind of dropped down a little. Otherwise, it's a great weapon because 50% armor piercing really takes away from the low attack it has. It only has 900 base attack, but if you take away 50% of enemy armor, that's going to make it much stronger. And on top of that, Zhao Yun uses his sword really, really well, and Zhao Yun eventually will start with this weapon in future DLCs. Then let's move on to the B tier, something with slightly more punch or something that's slightly more special. And we can start with the White Tiger's Claw. It's very similar to the Blue Blade in design, has a little bit more attack. It makes up for the lack of armor piercing in terms of the armor reduction by increasing the melee attack by 10%. And right now, you start out the game with it instead of the Blue Blade, which is in an awkward slot. So the White Tiger's Claw is going to be a little bit higher ranked. Then moving on, we can put the Sworn Brother, which has a very similar damage profile as these dual blades. We'll put them here. And then we'll go with a few polearms, which has good damage, but nothing too crazy about them, as in they don't stand out. So that would be polearms like the Serpent Spear, which has way too much base damage. Same thing with Guan Yu and Liu Bei's weapon. They're not very strong weapons, but it does give you 25 charge speed, so that's good, and the stats always really nice. And then in terms of damage, stuff that beat this spear but has no other standout effect is going to be all these cleavers and battle axes we have. So King Wu Tugu's axe. And we have Eater of Courage, which is Sima Yong's axe, and then Cleaver of Mountain, which is Xu Huang's axe. They have very similar data, right? They have the same damage profile, slightly different stats provided on each, but overall, they're pretty much the same. I think of the three, maybe Wu Tugu's axe is the best, I believe. I believe the stat provides is the highest, but they're close. There's really no difference between these three. You're happy with any of them. And then we can play Sneak another weapon to B. Similar to Zhang Fei's spear, we can put Gong Sun Zan's spear in here. I want to put it above all the battle axes. The reason why is you get 24 instinct on this weapon, which is very, very high. And you also get scare. So that's good. And damage-wise, it's not bad. I think it's slightly more focused on armor piercing than, say, Serpent Spear, which is really odd because spears usually have the armor piercing stat. So Zhang Fei's spear is like a exception to the game here. And then finally, let's move on to the A tier. Here is where we have some slightly special weapons that has some bonuses that make it stand out. And at the bottom of this group, I'm gonna put Guan Yu's weapon. So it's slightly better than Zhang Fei's, has higher damage and has better stats. But like I said, Liu Bei, Zhang Fei, Guan Yu's weapon, they can't hit the S tier because their damage is just heavily based. So unless you're murdering generals with no armor, or if you hit them with something that reduced their armor, like Wisdom the River, it's not an effective weapon. So it's going to be slightly lower. And then we have very good leadership swords. Let's just call them that. So Blade of Xiang Yu will be here, 18 point authority, some armor reduction, very high base damage, very fast attack speed, so 30 attack speed with about 1.7k base damage, 25% armor removal, very, very strong. Ancient Silver Sword, also 18 point authority, unbreakable, so another very strong weapon. I think it gives 10 points of satisfaction as well. And then we can probably throw in Trust of God as well. 24 points of authority, another very good leadership weapon. So these are the leadership swords, and that's all the sword they are in the game. And we're left with a bunch of polearm weapons, and not all of them is going to make it into the S tier. So Ancestral Pledge is not going to make it. It has a good set bonus, but because it's the unique quality, you can't stack it. So it's not as good as the bonus for the silver weapon actually, but still a decent weapon and a decent bonus, so I think we'll keep it up here. The Sky Piercer, we said, doesn't have the damage to back it up because it actually only has 800 base and about like 1.6k armor piercing, which is actually quite low. You do punish yourself with expertise loss, which is okay for Lu Bu because he's going to lose all his melee evasion anyways, but if you get this on another general, that could hurt you. The instinct is great. The unbreakable is really, really good. So that's why it's pretty much on the border of A and S, but the damage is really not there. Speaking of damages, these weapons are where the damage is at. Giant Bang, Head Crusher, Mountain Thunder. Mountain Thunder can be first because it actually provides more stat than the other two and also provides some leadership stats. But these are pretty much the same weapon. Even the art for these two are pretty much identical. It's kind of recycled in terms of stat usage, but they're not the best weapons. The best weapon is the mace that does less damage. These are 2.7k armor piercing. This one is 2.2, but the fire gives it additional 500 extra damage over 15 seconds. So it's not exactly the same matchup, but you also cut their morale by 15 points. You also cut their melee evasion by 50%. So it's very, very strong. And this is a great weapon to have. And just notice, this weapon's also not tilted the right way. So I guess the White Tiger Claw is not the only weapon that's tilting down. The Burning Mace also. That's strange. And that leaves us with the best weapon, the Red Sisters. It has a very good damage type. You have pretty good armor piercing on these, 24 attack speed for the dual one-handed users compared to the polearms that we have here with 20. And it has fatigue immunity, which wins it the game right away. Because it doesn't matter how strong your weapon is, if you get tired, all your stat goes down, you're not going to be as effective. So by having fatigue immunity on the weapon makes it great for no matter which general you give it to. So that's going to be the tier list for all the weapons. We're going to be moving on next week to the mounts. And we're going to do a similar tier list and a similar overview. So hopefully you guys will enjoy these series and see you guys next time. Bye!